Hello, and welcome to the Ministry Solvers podcast, where we help break silos and find ministry solutions to your problems. Today, we're going to get insights on unpacking small groups, and I'm super excited to announce our special guest, Bill Search. And Bill Search has been a leading voice in the small groups movement, authoring multiple articles and books, including the popular Essential Guide for Small Group Leaders. And he was a senior advisor for smallgroups.com and Christian Bible Studies at Christianity Today. And he's a graduate of Moody Bible Institute and Wheaton College Graduate School and has served churches all over the nation before moving to Crossings Community Church in 2018 as an executive pastor. In his current role, he helps oversee the largest campus, superintends pastoral training and development, and is a member of the teaching team. He has been married to his brilliant wife, Karen, for over 25 years, and they're blessed with 3 beautiful children. Bill, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Aaron. Just a delight to be with you.
Yes, sir. Glad to have you on, sir. So tell us a little bit more about you.
Oh, sure. I felt called to ministry in a very little Baptist church in Lansing, Michigan when I was 19 years of age. And I've never served a church smaller than 1,000. That's not bragging rights. It's just how it's rolled. And I have been astonished at the places God's put me and the opportunities He's given me, and I'm thankful for it. I'm not kidding. I regularly wake up and think, how is this my life? I just feel very privileged by the Lord to serve Him in the capacities that I have. And as you mentioned, I pastored churches all over the United States in all kinds of different roles, from senior pastor to teaching pastor to groups pastor to, as I do now, I have a lot of hats that I wear at a thriving church in Oklahoma City. So that's just a little bit, and I'm an avid reader. I consume books ferociously, and my besetting sin is buying books I probably don't need.
I think we're all guilty of that on some front, for sure. I mean, it seems like my library just keeps growing more every single day. But how many books would you say you read a year?
I read a book a week at least, so
Okay.
that's 52, but it's a little more than that. I do a lot of audibles, so some people don't consider that reading, but
Mm.
I do a lot of listening and that's how I take it in. And I read primarily theological, biblical history, nerdy kind of stuff that normal people don't really read. So my library, as I call it, is a working library. It has to work or it goes. So,
That's good.
how about you? How many? Since you asked me, how are you? What kind of reader are you? Do you read a lot?
Yes, I do. Now, I definitely don't read 52 books a year. I'm getting there for sure, but I'm always trying to either, like you say, do Audible or
Yeah,
have a book that I'm reading for sure. Because as they say, leaders are readers, right?
that's right. That's very, very true. Very
Yes.
true.
They also say nerds rule the world. So there you go.
Yeah, well, I think that actually is kind of true. Yeah.
I love it. So, how did small groups become such an important part of your life, and what made you so passionate about it?
Oh, what a great, you're just taking me back here, Aaron. My real first genuine small group experience was with my wife. We were newly married. We were at a church that was, it was growing and it was exciting. And they didn't have any other ministries except small groups. And my wife said, we should be in a small group. And I was like, no, we don't need to do that. I went to Moody, I went to Wheaton. If you have a Bible question, just ask me. I could probably find it, the answer. I might not know it. And then when she said, but we need to meet other young couples, I said, well, just tell me what the profile of young couple you want. I'll find them too. We don't need the church for that. And so I was reluctant, but she insisted, and we joined a group, and it was transformative. I had not only a great time, but I built some wonderful relationships in the process. And it truly was used of God to transform me and make me a better husband and later a better dad. So, just on the practical level, it was very helpful to me. And so I became an advocate of it. That was before I was on staff at a church. So then when I joined the staff of a church, then small groups became one of the things that I did. And we only did small groups at that church. We didn't have any other vehicles for connecting people to the body of the church other than serving in an area. So I then began to strategize about how to break through different barriers so that we could start more small groups because we had been using an old system that required a lot of preparatory work for the leader. And so, in the process of being on staff at that church, I helped navigate through and build some systems that were a little more risky, but they got more people into groups quicker. And in the process, our church and our group structures grew and grew. And so, that just kind of was the beginning of it all for me. That what I just described was over about an 8 year period, but
Mm.
it was electric. And it made me a firm believer that there's something powerful that God does when several people get into a room together and covenant together to go to a place together. There's something that happens there that's important.
That's good. Now you mentioned that that was a little bit before you were on staff,
Yeah.
but were you still in a small group after you became on staff?
Oh, yes, yes. In fact, throughout my whole ministry, I have been part of some sort of small group, whether it's a couples group, a men's group, whether it's something I've led or whether I just participate in it.
Mhm.
Uh, as the old, it's a little crass, but you better smoke what you sell. And I hope that's not offensive to the listeners there, but you'd better be a consumer of what you tell people about. I've met small group pastors before that aren't in any kind of group, and then I kind of question their sincerity. If it's good for other people, it's good for us too. So I know it's hard when you're on staff at a church. Even when I was a senior pastor, I had a small group and I participated in that small group. It wasn't always easy, but that group was really important to us when we were ministering in that church. So take the risk is what I'd say to the reluctant pastor.
That's good. So speaking of that, because I do feel like, once you're in leadership and you're leading a flock of people, it's a little bit different being in a small group as a pastor.
Yes.
And most times pastors, they're leading the small group. They're not actually in a small group just as a participant.
Yep.
So would you say for those leaders that they should, number one, be leading a group, and then number two, also be in a group where they're just a participant, or does it matter?
Yes, I'm not one to say always and never. That's the old test taking strategies, right? If the question says always or never, it's false. So I'm not one to say every pastor always should either lead or participate. I think that God has us in seasons. And I will acknowledge that some pastors in some roles have a difficulty forging what many small group people think of that deep and genuine and abiding community.
Mhm.
Through the years, I've kind of loosened the grip on some of my definitions of these things. And in fact, the first book I wrote, 15, 16 years ago, Simple Small Groups, which is still around. But that book, I talked about the kind of the levels at which you might experience community, or the levels at which you might experience transformation, or the levels at which you might live on a mission. And depending on the season of life and the type of group, that community might be lower, or it might be real intense. It just depends. And so I think the situation and the season calls for different approaches to these things. But I do think that a pastor ought to always have somebody in their life that has permission to speak truth and to also encourage them. And sometimes you're in multiple groups that do different things in your life.
Mhm.
So there's things I lead, and then there's things I participate in. And then just one last bit on this is in every group I've been part of, there's always people you find yourself more connected to and less connected to. No sin in that. You don't have to have every relationship at the same intensity level. There's just some people that you're going to have more connection with for one reason or another, and that's okay. And so God's always provided those people for me, and I have been thankful for it. I've needed them, and I think they've needed me too.
That's good. And I'm glad you kind of mentioned how those relationships can ebb and flow, where you may not necessarily be connected to a bunch of people, but it just may be a few people. And with that being said, like, what would you say are the essential things that actually make up a small group? Like, if we can apart the engine, so to speak, what
Yeah.
would you say are the essential pieces to that? And
Yeah.
also, is there a distinction between being in a small group versus being discipled by someone?
Oh, yeah. Okay. I really like that question too. You get Aaron, you asked really good questions. So
Thanks, buddy.
thank you. Thank you for giving me good questions. Okay, so the first bit on key components, and I don't mean to promote my books, but if someone's listening to it and goes, "What did he say again? I didn't write that down." The last book I wrote is called Vibrant Small Groups. It's more like a handbook than a book. And so it helps ministry leaders to both build assessment for how their small group ministry is going, but also if they're trying to reestablish a ministry, strengthen a ministry, it gives them all the tools to do that. So the key components, I think, through the years, I just kind of look at regularity, whether you meet once a week or whether you meet twice a month. Anything less than that, in my opinion, makes it difficult for the group to bond. If you meet once a month, it's not unimportant, but it might not be a small group at that point. So there's that bit. Then the other piece of it is a certain size. The larger the group, obviously it's not so small anymore. So in the church I serve, we have a traditional Sunday school structure as well. And I lead a small Sunday school that 2 weeks ago had 180 people in it. So it's more, that's it's almost twice the size of the church I grew up in. So, that it's not a small environment, but what we do in that is we create smaller communities within that. And then I participate in a men's group that has at any given morning has about 50 guys in it. Not a small group, but there's community that forges within it. But I do lead a group on Thursday morning that has 8 guys in it. And I'd say that's a small group. And it's the same basic 8 guys. So you have to have regularity of attendance. You have to have a small enough number for everybody to be able to participate. It's just math. If you meet for 1 hour and you have 12 people and everyone speaks for an equal volume of time, it's 5 minutes per person. So if you have for 2 hours, everybody gets 10 minutes. And if there's a lesson, a video, then you subtract, right? So you have to, a small group at its core is a place where people can digest an idea and talk about and ask questions and interact and maybe even disagree a little bit, but gently so. And if you're too big, you can't do that. So size of group, regularity of group, and then because we're talking about, small groups within the church setting, there needs to be some sort of biblical principle discussed, studied. There has to be some kind of lesson. Someone has to prepare something. You have to read the scriptures and know what the scriptures say, not just what people feel, but what they say. And then you can get to the how does that make you feel, and you get into the application bits. But all these are those are the core kind of pieces. You could add more to it. Some people say, no, if it doesn't have worship in it, it's not a small group. Okay, I'm not going to fight over these things, but I think when you synthesize it down, you have to have just that regularity, an identified group of people, a purpose for meeting, and then just that Christ is honored and lifted up. So then you asked another question about discipleship, and it's kind of a hobby horse of mine because all of the Christian walk is part of discipleship. So
Mhm.
sometimes people will separate out and go, real discipleship is this intense one-on-one or one-on-two or three, or it's a curriculum. I serve in a big church in Louisville, Kentucky. Great church. And I was on the discipleship staff, and there were about a dozen of us or more in that team of people. And we had a consultant person come in to talk about how to disciple people. And honestly, I would never recommend the person. I won't name them, but I wouldn't recommend them. But they had this idea that discipleship was this intense program that person had developed. So as we were sitting around a circle, my colleagues were talking about how they had never been discipled. And a couple of them were in tears. They were dabbing their ears. They felt terrible. They'd never been discipled. And I'm a bit of a challenger as a person. It's just kind of how God wired me. I'm not mean, but I challenge some of these processes. So I just said, it's funny to me that we're going around a circle and half of you or more than half of you feel like you've never been discipled. And yet you are serving as ministers at a great church doing great things.
Mhm.
So either you have been discipled or you're frauds. And I know you're not frauds. So you have been discipled. You just haven't been discipled in the way you think. So disciple just means follower. That's all the word means. It means a student, a learner, a pupil. So there's just like any student, there's C students and there's A students, right? And you can put a lot in and a little in. And so you can flunk out, but if you are found in Christ and faithful with Him, then you get a passing grade somehow, I suppose. But I think what we might better express is how do we continue to grow and flourish in our Christian life? That's to me what I want to do. I turn 53 later this year. When I turn 73, if the Lord should tarry and I'm still living, I want to have new vibrancy in my spiritual life. So to me, this is all part of the discipleship thing, is it just means you're growing, you're taking steps forward in Christ likeness. And that can be many different paths. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, feel free to probe some more.
No, that's good. I mean, it does make sense. I think sometimes people can get a little tripped up on the distinction just because we talk about Jesus and the 12. Like there was a different type of interaction with them, and then you talk about the three, Peter, James, and John, and just that intimacy that was there. And then you get to Acts 2 when we talk about the early church and they're meeting in homes in groups,
Yeah.
but you still had Barnabas and Paul, and you still had Paul and Timothy, so you still had those groups, Paul and Titus. So there was a little bit of a different relationship in those settings
Yeah.
compared to meeting in a home with 8 to 12 or how many they had back then. So what would you say to that in terms of those distinctions?
Sure. Yeah, I know. It's interesting is we're always trying to develop systems that are sort of bulletproof, but when we do examine the scriptures from Old and New Testament, we see God using various methodologies to help grow his people in ways that honor him. And so to your point, Jesus spent a lot of time with the 12, but he had a dropout rate of 1 out of 12. We always kind of forget when we talk about the 12, Judas failed. So that system wasn't bulletproof either. And
Mhm.
in John the 6th chapter, verse 66, it said, and then some of his disciples walked with him no more after Jesus' teaching became real strong. Now that wasn't among the 12. Those were disciples as well, but they were on the maybe the outer ring of things.
Right.
And then we do know that he traveled with another band of people that weren't among the 12, but they were. We know the names of a couple of them, one of them in particular who replaces Judas later. That's an Acts. They say, "Hey, we need to replace Judas. He failed." So they cast lots, and they said it's someone who has to have been with us since John's baptisms at the Jordan River. In other words, it's got to be somebody who's been with them for the long haul. And we know the guy's name. His name's Matthias.
Hmm.
We don't know a thing about Matthias other than that he was with Jesus from the beginning. So all this to say is there were these people that evidently were tracking with the Lord that weren't amongst that 12. But to your point, I think we can look at these things and we can see in them not formulas, but we can see patterns. And those patterns are really helpful. That is, some of the patterns are coming to the teaching. That's the Sermon on the Mount where the Lord spoke, or Peter in Acts where he's preaching at the temple and people are responding. So there's a place for the public preaching and public proclamation of God's word that not only evangelizes, but it old-fashioned term edifies, it grows the person. And then there are those places where they met in homes because you have to have a place where you're talking about how to live this Christian life. And did the pastor really mean that? Is that really what he means? Can I really do that? What if this happens in my life? You have to have a place where people can kind of go, well, let me tell you how that's worked out in my life and testify. That's that important a personal testimony. But at its best, personal testimony is more in a living room than it is on a platform. We'll do testimonies on platforms. They're nice, but you can't ask questions. It's rude, especially if your room has 1,000 people in it. But you in a living room, that's the place where you can testify about what the Lord's done. So I like what you pointed out there. We see these patterns of Paul with Timothy and Titus, and we see the importance of Barnabas' relationship with Paul. And so we can examine those things in the scriptures as we ought to without creating formulas for them, but see patterns in them. Does that make sense?
Gotcha. Yes. Yes. So in other words, just because you may see a pattern doesn't necessarily mean that they still weren't getting the same content as if they would if it was in a small group context. It just
Yeah.
may have been a different setting per se, or a different
Yeah.
relationship. Yeah.
College for me was I went to, as you mentioned, I went to Moody. They're apparently the unwritten sponsor of this podcast. They've been mentioned a few times, but I'm real proud of my alma mater, and I was greatly edified by 2 years of New Testament Greek. That was nothing like a small group. I'll tell you that right now. It kicked my rear end, but I fell in love with the New Testament even more, and then it opened up opportunities to learn more about the Bible and theology. And so that God used in an edifying way. A classroom can be an edifying space that can grow the believer in Christ likeness. Or it can also send somebody off sideways, as can a small group, as can one-on-one, right? I mean, per the Judas comment, or Ananias and Sapphira later in the book of Acts. They were playing games in the church as well. And so it's entirely possible to be in the system but to not be in God. So we need to be in the Lord, and then the systems are there to provide increased opportunity to grow in the Lord. But so I'm a big fan of systems. I build them all the time. So I'm not knocking anyone who's like, well, he's anti-institutional. I am no such thing. I create institutions just as a hobby. So so
That's good.
systems systems work or
No, I
should.
love and to your point, I mean, for me, it wasn't just one thing. I started off at a small church that had a Sunday school program, and that was my discipleship for a certain period. And then from that point on, then when I got to college, I was able to be a part of a small group. I didn't know what a small group was, but that was my first initiation to it. And from there, from that small group, that leader discipled me one on one, and then from there seminary. So, it wasn't necessarily one thing, but it was a combination of things. And so
Right.
that's important for all of us as believers to recognize. Is that, it's just not just, hey, I go to church and I read my Bible and that's it. But no, like, let's add some other things in there to continue to grow you in your faith and equip you to be the person that God's called you to be. And then on top of that, it's not just information, but it's also living it out. It's also the experience part too, which you see with Jesus and his disciples when he sends them out, where you see, Paul sending Timothy and Titus on an assignment. So I think that's also an essential part of that discipleship piece and that small group piece as well.
That's right. That's right. You got it. And I love that's part of your testimony is the various ways. And I think if as we reflect on how God has grown us, we think of uh, the Psalms. I love the Psalms because the Psalms will testify of the various ways God grows the believer. Sometimes it's through adversity, and sometimes it's through the family of origin, and sometimes it's through the meetings at the Temple Mount. And there's all these different ways in which God grows the person. But at the end of it, they're still saying, hey, you use this and you use this, you use this. And that's part of our stories of how God intersects with us. But I don't know anyone. I don't know everyone, of course, but I don't know anyone who has really tracked deeply spiritually who isn't able to look back and go, that person
Mm.
or those people or this community. There's people. There's always people, and those people have names. I know part of your story because you've shared it before. You were discipled somewhere in there by Lecrae, and you probably should interview him one of these times. That would be a good one. So
Yes, well, he's winning Grammys these days, so I don't know if I
he's
can.
kind of busy, I'm sure. Yeah, but maybe on when he's on the tour bus, he could phone it in, Aaron.
Absolutely, absolutely. So one thing that is interesting about the history of small groups is the fact that after the Acts 2 story, there was an intense persecution of the church. And then from that point on, Constantine came into the picture. And and then from there was kind of a drop off with small
Mhm.
groups.
Yeah,
And then there was a resurgence with small groups. So, and
yeah.
there were people like John Wesley, Anthony Pernick, and Zinzendorf and Spencer that kind of helped kind of get that going. So, can you talk about sort of the history of small groups with that?
Thanks for listening to the Ministry Solvers podcast, where we help you find ministry solutions to your problems. We hope that you enjoyed part one of our interview with Bill Search. And look forward to sharing part 2 of our interview in the coming weeks as he dives deeper into the nuts and bolts of small groups. Perhaps you have small groups at your church, perhaps you don't. Bill Search is going to share key insights on how to take your groups to the next level, no matter where you are. So we hope that you will join us. But until then, may God bless you and keep you, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.